Good morning. Today we will be reading the fifth book in the Left Behind series. The title of the book is Apollyon, and today I'm going to be reading chapter 15, and I will begin to read now. Eating a late dinner that evening, Tyson shared with the stateside's tribulation force his joy over I merely put out a simple request. You all saw it for translators in various countries to interpret the daily messages in their own languages. You can imagine how much of the net is made up of Asian language groups, Spanish, German, and others. Well, he added with a twinkle, not only did I get far more volunteers than I needed, but some very advanced computer types are offering free software downloads that automatically translate into other languages. It's Pentecost on the net. I'm able to type in unknown tongues. Rayford was always warmed by the joy Tyson took in his work and ministry. He had sacrificed as much as anyone in their little group, a wife and two children. Chloe had lost her mother and brother, and now two friends. Rayford had lost two wives, his son, his pastor, and more new acquaintances that he wanted to think about. Everybody around the table, Doc, Charles, and Hattie included, had reason to go mad if they allowed themselves to dwell on it. Momentarily, smiles were all they could muster when Tyson shared a story like that, or someone made the occasional wry comment. Raucous laughter or silliness just didn't have a place in their lives anymore. Grief was wearying, Rayford thought. He looked forward to that day when God would wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there would be no more war. That was the That was one reason he looked forward with relish to the 10 o'clock news event that had been trumpeted on the GC broadcasting networks all day. The GC was bringing together experts who would speak to the official statement of the government related to the darkness that had already begun to take its toll. Buck had insinuated that Chaim would be entertaining. Although Rayford couldn't imagine a belly laugh, he looked forward to the diversion. I just hope, Tyson said, that we detect some movement in Chaim's spirit. When I was laying out all the prophecies again for him, I challenged him. I said, Chaim, how can a man with such a mind as yours ignore the mathematical impossibility of so many dozens of prophecies referring to just one man, unless he is the Messiah? He started with the typical argument about not knowing whether the Bible is authentic. I said, my mentor, you would doubt your own Torah? Torah? Where did you think I am coming up with this stuff? I tell you, young people, it won't be long for Chaim. I just don't want him to wait too long. Rayford, just 3 or so years younger than Tyson, loved being referred to as a young person. Hattie spoke up, her voice stronger than ever. Do you still feel that way about me, Dr. Ben Judah? Or have I convinced you I am a lost cause? Tyson put his fork down and pushed his plate away. Miss Durham, he said quietly, are you sure you want to hear my thoughts on your situation in front of the others? Go for it, she said, just short of gleeful. I have no secrets, and I know you people sure don't. Tyson entwined his fingers. All right, since you brought it up and gave me permission, you and I rarely interact. I hear what you say, and I know where you stand, and you know that my whole life is now dedicated to proclaiming what I believe. So my views are not a mystery to you either. You are nearly 20 years my junior, and we are of opposite sexes. And so there is a generational and gender barrier that has perhaps caused me to be less frank with you than I might have been with someone else. But it might surprise you to know how frequently during each day God brings you to my mind. Rayford thought Hattie looked more than surprised. She had a glass of water suspended between the table and her lips, and her bemused smile had frozen. Again, I do not intend to embarrass you. Oh, you can't embarrass me. Doc, let me have it. She smiled as if she had finally reeled in a big one. If you would permit me to speak from my heart, please, she said, setting her glass down and settling herself as if ready to enjoy this. Rayford thought she enjoyed being in Tyson's spotlight. I feel some compassion for you, Tyson said. Such a longing for you to come to Jesus. And suddenly he could not continue. His lips trembled and he could not form words. Hattie raised her eyebrows, staring at him. Forgive me, he managed in a whisper, taking a sip of water and collecting himself. He continued through tears. Somehow, God has allowed me to see you through his eyes. A scared, angry, shaken young woman who has been used and abandoned by many in her life. He loves you with a perfect love. Jesus once looked upon his audience and said, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. Miss Durham, you know the truth. I have heard you say so, and yet you are not willing. No, I do not consider you a lost cause. I pray for you every bit as much as I pray for Chaim, because Jesus went on to say about the hard-hearted people of Jerusalem, I say to you, you shall see me no more till you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. I look at you in your fragile beauty and see what life has done to you, and I long for your peace. I think of what you could do for the kingdom during these perilous times, and I am jealous to have you as part of our family. I fear you're risking your life by holding out on God, and I do not look forward to how you might suffer before he reaches you. I'm sorry if I embarrassed you, but you asked. Hattie sat shaking her head, and Rayford had the impression she was more surprised than embarrassed. She did not respond except to go from shaking to nodding. What time is that news thing? She asked. Right now, Chloe said, and everyone cleared his own dishes. Buck settled in front of the television in Jerusalem with his notepad. Fascinated by the foreboding dusk at dawn, he was grateful that both Jacob and Stefan were off and had showed up to watch the press conference with him. Press conference was a misnomer, of course, now that global community owned the media. Only in underground publications like Buck's did readers get objective substance. That was what made Chaim's appearance so intriguing. If he had the guts to follow through on what he had told Buck, he would say it would be the most controversial thing on television since Tyson's startling testimony. No, Rosenzweig had not become a believer, at least not yet, but he had clearly grown tired of being used by the GC regime. The program began with what had become the obligatory fawning over the panelists. It seemed every time the GC wanted to persuade the populace of some cockamamie theory, it paraded pedigree know-it-alls before the camera and buttered them up. The host introduced the head of GCASA, the head of GCP&L, various and sundry scientists, authors, dignitaries, and even entertainment personalities. Each luminary had smiled shyly during the recitation of his and her litany of achievements and qualifications. Buck snorted out loud when the host actually used the phrase, and last but certainly not least, the camera panned to the tiny Albert Schweitzer-looking man on the end, and the scrolling legend along the bottom of the screen bore his name. Chaim looked neither shy nor humble, but rather bemused, as if this whole thing was a bit much. Chaim tilted his head back and forth as if mocking himself as the platitudes rambled on and on. Former professor, writer, botanist, winner of the Nobel Prize, honorary this, honorary that, speaker, diplomat, ambassador, personal friend, and confidant of His Excellency the Potent. Chaim drew circles with an open hand as if they should wrap it up. The host finished. Once Global Weekly's Man of the Year, inventor of the formula credited with being Israel a world power, Dr. Chaim Rosenzweig. There was no studio audience, and even the GC press corps was against applauding. So the energetic intro died a conspicuous, awkward death, and the show moved on. The host first read the entire GC statement while the test scrolled on the screen. Buck's tension mounted when he, as he feared, the host began by asking for the opinion and comment of the first expert on the left. He would continue in the same order they had been introduced. Buck worried that viewers would lose patience and nod off from boredom by the time they got around to Chaim. One advantage to the GC-controlled media. Despite 500 channel choices, this was on every station. Buck had to remind himself that even for millions who ignored what they considered the ravings of a madman like Tyson Ben Judah, the sudden darkness was frightening. They tuned in for answers from their government and likely considered this the most important program they had ever watched. Buck only hoped they would stay around for the last guy. The payoff would be worth it. Everyone on the panel, of course, praised the first and efficient and thorough work of the GCASA and assured the public that this was a minor event, a temporary condition. As alarming as the darkness is, a woman on the management staff of Global Community Power and Light said, "We agree it will have negligible impact on the quality of life as we know it, and it should correct itself in a matter of days." When at long last they got to Chaim, Buck felt a sense of community with his people in the States. The idea that they were all watching the same thing made the miles shrink momentarily, and he longed to have his wife cuddle next to him. "Will," Chaim began dramatically, "who am I to add to or distract from anything said by any of these brilliant interplanetary galactic astronomical phenomena? As for the dear woman who promises this will have no impact on our quality of life, let me say how disappointed I am. Our quality of life the last few years has been nothing to write home about. I am but a simple botanist who happened upon a combination that turned out to be magic water, and suddenly my opinion is sought on everything from the price of sausage to whether defiant preachers at the Wailing Wall are real or make-believe. You want my opinion? Okay, I will give it to you. To tell you the truth, I don't know. I don't know who turned the lights out, and I'm not sure I want to know who the two gentlemen are at the wall. I just wish they would bring back the pure water and let it rain once in a while. Is that too much to ask? But let me tell you this, now that I have your attention, I do have your attention, don't I?" The camera panning back to the speechless host exposed the shocked impressions of the other guests. It was clear they thought Rosenzweig had finally stepped off the edge. As should come as no surprise to anyone, I am not a religious man. A Jew by birth, of course, and proud of it. Wouldn't have it any other way, but to me, it's a nationality, not a faith. All that to say this, many, myself included, were horrified to hear what happened to the family of my beloved protege and former student, who grew up to be the respected linguist and biblical scholar, Rabbi Tyson Ben Judah. I confess in my heart of hearts I had to wonder if he hadn't brought this on himself. Condone the killings. Never as long as I live. But would I advise a man to go on international television from the very land where the name Jesus Christ is at anathema to your neighbors and tell the world you had become a turncoat? a Christ follower, a believer that Jesus is the Messiah. Madness. I was doubly horrified when he became a fugitive, exiled from his own homeland, his life worth nothing. But did I lose respect for him, admire him less? How could I, knowing such risks, taking such stands? Thank you, Dr. Rosenzweig, the host began, obviously getting instructions through his earpiece. Oh, no, you don't, Rosenzweig said. I have earned the right to another minute or so, and I demand that I not be unplugged from the air. I just want to say that I am still not a religious man, but my religious friend, the aforementioned rabbi, has spoken to the very issue we address today. Now you may rest easy. I have come back to the point. Ben Judah was ridiculed for his beliefs, for his contentions. The scriptural prophecy could be taken literally. He said an earthquake would come. It came. He said hail and blood and fire would scorch the plants. They did. He said things would fall from the sky, poisoning water, killing people, sinking ships. They fell. He said the sun and moon and the stars would be stricken and the world would be 1/3 darker. Well, I am finished. I don't know what to make of it, except that I feel a bigger fool every day. And let me just add, I want to know what Dr. Tyson Ben Judah says is coming next, don't you? And he quickly added the address of Tyson's website. The host was still speechless. He looked at Chaim, brows raised. Go ahead, Chaim said. Pull the plug on me. Rayford was frustrated that he had not made it to the Pewaukee that day. And he wouldn't make it to the next day either, or the next. The reduction of solar power affected every facet of an already difficult existence, including the transmission of Tyson's lessons. Dr. Rosenzweig's endorsement of Tyson's teaching resulted in the most massive number of hits on what was already a site 10 times more popular than any other in history. And yet, broadcasting Tyson's daily messages became an arduous chore that forced Rayford to delay any other activity. Repeated failures on the internet were blamed on the solar problems. Believers all over the globe rallied to try to copy and pass the teachings along as necessary, but it became impossible to track the success of that effort. Chloe's efforts at building a private marketplace in anticipation of the mark of the beast nearly ground to a halt. Over the next several weeks, seasons were skewed. Major Midwest cities looked like Alaska in the dead of the winter. Power reserves were exhausted. Hundreds of thousands of all over the world died of exposure. Hundreds, even the vaunted GC, having conventionally ignored adjusting their initial assessment, now looked for someone to blame for the curse. Confused in the tragic panic surrounding the crisis was the role of Ben Judah. He had predicted it, as Rosenzweig had asserted, or had he called it down from heaven? Peter II decried Ben Judah, and the two preachers are reckless practitioners of black magic, proving it by showing live shots of the Wailing Wall. While snow swirled and drifted and Israelis paid top dollar for protective clothing, stayed inside, and used building material for fuel, there stood Eli and Moshe in their same spot. They were still barefoot, still clad only in their loose-hanging sackcloth robes, arms bare. With only their deeply tanned skin, their beards and long hair between them, and the frigid temperatures, they preached and preached and preached. Surely the self-ascribed supreme pontiff railed, if there is a devil, he is a master of these two. Who other than deranged demonic beings could withstand these elements and continue to spout irrational diatribes? Nikolai Karpathy himself was strangely silent and his visage scarce. Finally, when the global community seemed powerless, he addressed the world. During a brief session of solar activity at midday in the Middle East, In the Middle East, Mac was able to place a call to Rayford, who answered a cell phone with ancient batteries that had been recharged by a generator. The connection was bad and they couldn't talk long. "Watch the Potent tonight if you can, Ray," Max shouted. "We're warm as toast even in the snow here because he has marshaled all the energy we need for the palace. But when he goes on TV, he's going to be wearing a huge parka he has shipped in from the Arctic." Mac was right. Rayford and Floyd worked to store as much energy as they could from various sources so they could watch the smallest TV in the safe house. The whole lot of them huddled to watch and stay warm. Hattie continuing to maintain, "I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm only getting what I deserve." Tyson said, "My dear, you will find that none of the sealed of the Lord will die due to this judgment. This is an attention getter aimed at the unbelievers. We suffer because the whole world suffers, but it will not mortally harm us. Don't you want the same protection?" She did not answer. Buck, shivering underground with Stefan and Jacob, could not find the power to watch Carpathia on TV. The group listened on a radio with a signal so weak they had to hold their collective breath to hear him. In Mount Prospect, Rayford, Tyson, Chloe, Floyd, and Hattie watched as Carpathia came on TV in a bare studio, clapping his mittens and bouncing on his toes as if freezing to death. "Citizens of the global community," he intoned, "I applaud your courage, your cooperation, your sense of loyalty and togetherness as we rise to the challenge of enduring yet another catastrophe. I come to you at this hour to announce my plan to personally visit the two preachers at the Wailing Wall who have admitted their souls in the plagues that have befallen Israel. They must now be forced to admit that they are behind this dastardly assault on our new way of life. Apparently, they are invulnerable to a physical attack. I will call upon their sense of decency, of fairness, of compassion, and will go with an open mind, willing to negotiate. Clearly, they want something. If there is something I can bargain with that will threaten the dignity of my that will not threaten the dignity of my office or harm the citizens I live for, I am willing to listen and consider anything. I shall make this pilgrimage tomorrow, and it will be carried on live television. As the global community headquarters in New Babylon naturally has more power reserves than most areas, we will record this historic encounter with the hope that all of you will be able to enjoy it when this ordeal is finally over. Take heart, my beloved ones. I believe the end of this nightmare is in sight." "He's going personally to the wall," Buck said. "Is that what I just heard?" Stefan nodded. "We should go." "They won't let anyone near the place," Jacob said. "They might," Buck said. He suggested the three of them bundle up as quickly as possible and find a location with a clear view of the wrought iron fence. "We can build a shelter there that looks like just a wood box." "We're down to the last few sheets of plywood for fuel now," Stefan said. "That green stuff in the cellar. We'll bring it back with us," Buck said, "and use it for fuel later." The plan proved his most foolhardily yet. His face was still tender in spots and numb in others since getting the stitches out several weeks before. He had not expected to have to deal with frostbite in Israel. He and his two compatriots found a stairway that led to an abandoned building with a sealed door, fewer than 100 yards from the wall. With Carpathia expected at noon, they built their shelter in the pitch blackness of the morning. If others ventured out in the howling blizzard, Buck and his friends didn't see them. They were raw and cold by the time they climbed into their rough-hewn box with slits for viewing. Buck, ever the journalist, just had to see what the thing might look like to a passerby. "I'll be right back," he said. "You're going out in this again?" Jacob said. "Just for a minute." Buck jogged 100 feet from the staircase and tried to make out the box in the blowing snow and low output from a nearby light pole. Perfect, he thought. It would draw no one's attention. As he trudged back, he squinted in the darkness toward the wall, knowing the witnesses were there but unable to see them. He detoured to get closer. From what he could tell, they were not by the fence. He drew closer. confidence he could not surprise or frighten them, and that they would know in their spirits he was a believer. He stepped as close to the fence as he had ever been, recalling one of the first times he had ever conversed with them from just a few feet away. A break in the wind allowed him to see the two, sitting their backs against the stone building. They sat casually, elbows on knees, conversing. They were not huddled, still impervious to the elements. Buck wanted to say something, but nothing came to mind. They didn't seem to need encouragement. They didn't seem to need anything. When in unison they glanced up at him standing there, he just nodded with his stiff neck like a kid in a binding snowsuit and raised both fists in support. His heart leapt when he saw them smile for the first time, and Eli raised a hand of greeting. Buck ran back to the shelter. "Where you been, man?" Jacob said. "We thought you got lost or frozen or something." Buck just sat, wrapping his arms around his knees, hunching his shoulders, and shook his head. "I'm fine," he said. GC troops kept crowds several blocks away. Once the motor coach arrived, bearing Nikolai and his entourage, the, the wind and snow had stopped, but the noonday sun hardly warmed the area. Carpathia remained on the bus as TV personnel set up lights and sound and cameras. Finally, they signaled the Potentate, and several of his top people, led by Fortunato, disembarked. Carpathia was the last to appear. He approached the fence, behind which the two witnesses still sat. As the world watched on television, Carpathia said, "I bring you cordial greetings from the global community. I assume because of your obvious supernatural powers that you knew I was coming." Eli and Moshe remained seated. Moshe said, "God alone is impotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. Nonetheless, I am here on behalf of the citizens of the earth to determine what course we might take to gain respite from this curse on the planet." The witnesses stood and stepped forward. "We will speak to you alone." Carpathia nodded at his minions, and Fortunato, clearly reluctant, led them back to the motor coach. "All right then," Carpathia said. "Shall we proceed? We will talk with you alone." Carpathia looked puzzled, then said, "These people are merely television technicians, cameramen, and so forth. We will talk with you alone." Nikolai cocked his head in resignation and sent the TV crew away as well. "May we leave the cameras running? Would that be all right?" "Your quarrel is not with us," Eli said. "Beg pardon?" "You are not behind the darkness, the resilient global chaos. Only God is impotent. I am seeking your help as men who claim to speak for God. If this is of God, then I plead with you to help me come to some arrangement, an agreement, a compromise, if you will." "Your quarrel is not with us." "Well, all right, I understand that. But if you have access to him, your quarrel is not with... I appreciate that point. I am asking..." Suddenly, Moshe spoke so loudly that the sound meters had to have maxed out. "You would dare wag your tongue as the chosen ones of Almighty... at the chosen ones of Almighty God. I apologize. You were boasted that we would die before the due time. Granted, I concede that you who deny the one true God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, in the spirit of accusation and tolerance, yes, I do hold that one should not limit his view of deity to one image, but there is one God and one mediator between God and the man Christ Jesus." That is a valid view, of course, just like many of the other views. "It is written, beware, lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the traditions of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ. Do you not see that yours is such an exclusivist? Your quarrel is not with us." We are back to that again, are we? In the spirit of diplomacy, let me suggest. But the two witnesses turned away and sat down again. "So that is it then. Before the eyes of the world, you refuse to talk, to negotiate. All I get is that my quarrel is not with you. With whom, then, is it? All right, fine." Carpathia marched in front of the main camera and stared into it from inches away. He spoke wearily, but with his usual precise enunciations. Upon further review, the death of the Global Community Guard at the meeting of the witnesses was not the responsibility of any of the witnesses or any member of Dr. Ben Judah's inner circle. The man killed by GC troops at the airport was not a terrorist. My good friend, Dr. Chaim Rosenzweig, was at no time and in no way holding Ben Judah or his people at our behest. As of this moment, no one sympathetic to Dr. Ben Judah and his teachings is considered a fugitive or an enemy of the global community. All citizens are equally free to travel and live their lives in a spirit of liberty. I do not know with whom I am or should be negotiating, but I assure whoever it is that I stand willing to make whatever other concessions would move us closer to the end of this plague of darkness. He turned on his heel, sarcastically saluted the two witnesses, and reboarded the motor coach. As the TV crew rushed to gather their equipment and the witnesses spoke the unison from where they sat, clearly loud enough for anyone, even Carpathia, to hear, "Woe, woe, woe unto all who failed to look up and lift up your heads." 2 days later, the sun rose bright and full, and the earth began to thaw. Buck made plans to fly home freely under his own name. "I can't fly directly to Chicago commercially," he told Rayford. "Even with the reconstruction of Midway, I have to go through Europe. Any connection through Athens? I'll check." "Why?" Rayford asked that he check on Lucas Miklos. "I'll see if he can greet you at the airport. It won't delay your trip home, and it'll really encourage him." In Mount Prospect, Tyson told Rayford he was working on what would be his most dramatic and ominous warning yet. Meanwhile, he broadcast worldwide over the internet. "Because of the proven truth of Luke 21, I urge all believers and unbelievers alike to train your eyes on the skies. I believe this is the message from the two witnesses." Doc Charles dug out and cleaned up Donnie Moore's telescope, and with millions around the world, began monitoring the heavens. But when Tyson announced in one of his daily messages that he was investigating a way to build a website that would allow others to watch the skies through the same telescope, Rayford received a frenetic call from David Hasid in New Babylon. "Glad I caught you," he said breathlessly. "How far along are you on that telescope website idea?" "Couple of days yet. Won't take our people long." "You don't want to do that. A little software and a bright astronomer could just about pinpoint where you guys are." Rayford put a hand atop his head. "Thanks for that, David. I never would have thought of it. Anyway, the Potent himself has authorized the purchase of a colossal telescope, and I get to work with the guys who will man it. Several can monitor it at once through various computers." "Well, David, you know what we're looking for." "I sure do." And that is the end of chapter 15. They are waiting for Jesus to come from heaven now. We'll be reading chapter 16 next. Thank you for joining me, and have a wonderful day.